Chao, Bobby, ¿estás bien?
Okay, here we go. Good evening to everybody. You guys won't be able to see me, and obviously it's a bit awkward for me to to talk in front of a screen. There are more than 800 participants, 837 to be precise. I thank you very much for attending this topic, and I must admit that I'm a little bit excited. Obviously, English is not my mother tongue, but yeah, okay, I'll give it a go. First, a bit about me. I'm a Bachelor of Physiotherapy. I've done my education in the beginning of the 80s in the Netherlands. And after a year, I decided to take a little adventure in Switzerland, and that adventure now lasts for 36 years. I'm a musculoskeletal physiotherapy teacher at the Master OMPT program in Switzerland, Lugano, at the SOBRE University. My first course I did was in the Netherlands, sports physiotherapy. Wasn't a university course, but actually was pretty funny, pretty well done, very technical on how to manage actively a patient. I am a musculoskeletal teacher for the INTA. I mainly teach in Italy. This year I have to teach a little bit in Greece as well, a small course, and I have something to do in Germany as well. I am a rehabilitation consultant for a professional ice hockey club from the Swiss National League since 2010 for Hockey Club Lugano. I'm a private practitioner, so the first 10 years of my career I worked for some other people, and after 94 I started to do my own physiotherapy practice. I really enjoy the variability in my work. I like to be very active. Cycling, running, skiing, swimming, and I like cooking. Okay, let's start off with the professional definition. Interesting, when I teach in several countries and I ask what is the professional definition of physiotherapy, apparently the participants do not really know what I'm referring to. If I ask them what is the WCPT, very often, actually, they don't really know what it is. So let's get back to the professional definition. Physiotherapy is concerned with identifying and maximizing quality of life and movement potential within the spheres of promotion, prevention, treatment and intervention, habilitation and rehabilitation. And that's quite a mouthful, and I think that gives us also quite a bit of responsibility. Now, having said that we are working in the realms of movement potential, obviously that means that we are working very close to physical education. We're working in the realms of health, of overall fitness, of quality of life and of well-being. And within that realm, we have to actually take care of a huge variety of patients. First of all, pain patients, pluritraumatic patients, or patients who suffer severe deconditioning, patients who suffer confusion and anxiety. And on the other end of the spectrum, maybe you also have to deal with elite sports professionals. You have to deal with strength and conditioning, return to play. So actually, the resources a physiotherapist needs to have are quite large. So we're dealing with health and quality of life, and we try to do that through movement behavior. But then again, movement is an important part of health, and health and quality, though, is but more than movement. And pain, if we have to deal with pain isn't always related to movement. So health enhancing physical activity and quality of life. But obviously, health enhancing physical activity, health is only a small part of health. Because obviously we have cognitive rational health, affective emotional health, socioeconomic health, and nutritional health. And obviously, when you close one door, you obviously open another one. Unfortunately, all too often, the professional identity is related to some kind of method, or is related to posture, some kind of tool, some kind of technique, some kind of painful spots on body parts, using maybe even defined maps, or all too often professional identity is led by diagnosis. And a lot of proceedings, tests, and treatments are being proposed, a lot of interpretations and visions, but often all these are rather questionable and lacking scientific fundament. So let's have a look at what the professional profile is of the Dutch physiotherapist. The physiotherapist encourages the client to adopt a movement-related behavior and that has a favorable effect on their health and assists them in performing activities. Okay, so again, bodily health, but what kind of health are you referring to? If it's not only movement related, obviously we are in other realms as well. And if I look at the core determinants of health, there are several non-modifiable factors. I cannot, through therapy, actually influence healthy child development. That's not my task, or I can't change culture. So we have to look for the things that we can control, and we have to focus on the things that matter. Another interesting quote from Dr. Carl Lewitt, a former doctor from Czechoslovakia. He said, rehabilitation is to show a patient what they can do for themselves, which obviously is a very interesting and strong and very, very realistic statement. Again, let's get back to the professional profile of the Dutch Physiotherapy Organization. The physiotherapist collects information from the international scientific literature, interprets, applies, and critically reflects on his own practices, asks colleagues for providing feedback, and sets himself personal objectives. Well, this is about attitude. So if I put that all together, all this information, physiotherapists ensures high quality care of working according to the principles of evidence-informed practice, aiming at exploring, restoring, help managing, and optimizing individual health, human functioning, and quality of life. Let's have a look at literature updates. So if I look at the argument rehabilitation, actually, I took the last 10 years of the argument rehabilitation. And as you can see, the amount of publicized papers growing in a rather steep way. I come to a calculation of about 88 papers I have to read a day. If I narrow that down to active rehabilitation, I still have to read around 30 papers a day. If I look at tendon rehabilitation, I have to read around 12.5 papers per week. And if I look at tendon systematic reviews, I have to read 97.4 articles per year, or that's around 2 per week. So, are we actually well prepared for this? Is there uniformity in our education? And do we learn in our basic education to deal with this big amount of scientific updates? I don't think we are. If I look at the item musculoskeletal disorders, I come to 84 papers I have to read per day, and I was only looking at the last 3 years. If I look at the argument pain, I have to read 127 articles a day. Chronic pain, if I narrow it down to chronic pain, it's still 20.6 articles per day. If I look at musculoskeletal pain, I have to look at 5.5 articles a day. And if I narrow that down to osteoarthritis, I have to read 14 articles a day. So actually, you can see that the argument pain is a very important argument, and again, the ISP has been developing a 3-year pre-license doctor of physiotherapy program in Sydney, Australia, where you learn the clinical competences in pain management. But obviously, it's not only about pain, it's not only about musculoskeletal disorders, it's also about strength and conditioning. And that means I have to read 2.2 papers a day. So if I pile it up, then I come to roughly 250 papers per day. And that's a huge amount, obviously. And that means you better get prepared and you get organized. Otherwise, it's impossible to have constant updates for our profession. So that brings me to didactics. What can we do to facilitate learning? How can we organize the accessibility to knowledge? And how can we bring forward comprehensive, updated structure, which is therefore also recognizable? Again, so on the one hand, we have principles of science, and on the other hand, we have principles of rehabilitations, where didactic structure and organization may find a place. And obviously, we have evidence over time and knowledge over time, which becomes obsolete. And new knowledge and new evidence is streaming in. So we have to do with a lot of change, and obviously, that gives us a chance. There is no other choice, actually. We have to deal with the constant stream of updates. And therefore, I think we need rehabilitation principles. So let's dive a little bit into the rehabilitation principles and maybe even some philosophy of our profession. So I came to 12 principles, 12 structured principles, and we go through this list as long as we go on. Okay, so the first principle is we have an evidence-informed academic profession. That means you're a lifetime learner and you are a continuous updater, so you'd better get organized. And actually, this is also perfectly expressed in the Cochrane's Living Systematic Reviews, which have been recently proposed by the Cochrane Library. So they propose constant updates. And all the change, obviously, is not that easy to deal with. It has a little bit to do with your character. Most likely, are you into new information, or do you prefer the security of the old systems? So where do you place yourself? Are you an innovator? Are you an early adopter? Or do you see yourself more in the late majority of adapters or in the laggards? And obviously, being born as a physiotherapist in the 80s, I had obviously to do with all the pioneers of those days, which actually based their knowledge most of all on empirical evidence. Some of them, some of these pioneers were more interested in the passive part of therapy. Some of them were more interested in the active part of therapy, and obviously there was already in those days quite a bit of a struggle. Their concepts were based on either functional anatomy or based on biomechanics. They proposed procedures and techniques, but they also talked about planning and about hypothesis gathering. They talked about progression of treatment. They were talking, or some of them were talking, about communication and patient-centeredness. But most of all, they saw pain in some way related to movement, and their ideas were often mostly structural. And obviously in the early 90s, things started to change. Wendell and Joel started to propose a research. Max Zussman was talking about pain and was questioning a lot of the things the gurus were saying. Obviously, people like Lorimer Moseley and David Butler came on talking about mechanosensitivity of the nervous system and neurodynamics, but also about pain. The late Louis Gifford, brilliant ideas, but also very challenging ideas. Information about tendon rehabilitation, new ideas about cognitive functional therapy by Peter O'Sullivan, brilliant ideas about pain from Mick Thacker, a lot of questions by Greg Lehman, and a lot of information from others as well. Shoulder, or again, pain or rehabilitation of the back by Paul Hodges. Again, other people who are questioning all of this, like John Quintner and Asaf Klaff-Weizmann, and obviously Ben Cormack and Adam Meekins. And obviously this list can go on and on. There are much more people obviously involved, but I mean, for the moment, I guess this is enough. And I must say I really enjoy the critical voices. It makes me reflect. And I stay concentrated on the content and not so much on the ways of delivery. But again, there is definitely a shift visible, okay? A shift which goes from proposals of techniques and proceedings towards research. There is a shift from patterns towards philosophy. There is a shift from movement analysis towards person analysis. And as long as we don't quarrel too much about it, I do see this as a normal and healthy change of our profession. Again, and it's not strange that things are evolving, and it is not strange that we certainly come from diagnosis, and we were in those days, the early 80s, beginning of the 90s, and mostly still in some way are, a little bit related to diagnosis recipe. That gives us a certain way in which we can proceed. But rehabilitation most of the time is a non-linear observational process of goal-orientated interaction. And that non-linear process, observational process, obviously has ups and downs. So it's very important that we find a balance. And it's not easy to find a balance. There's so much information now available, either from scientific journals or through Facebook groups who are speaking about the different items and are discussing openly, very often very, very interesting. So actually there's no excuse not to update yourself. And again, that will be decisive about the physiotherapist's identity. So let's get back to the clinic. Do you ever ask yourself the question, why does this person become a patient? Is it related to trauma, to overuse, or is the patient underusing his structures and is therefore deconditioned? Is it related to stress, psychophysical features of disease or sleep disorders? Is it related to lifestyle-related factors or social determinants? Does the person suffer of organic factors of disease, or is it a genetic predisposition or related to age? Again, personality drives behavior. And maybe some of the persons have a multiple personality disorder, hypochondriacs, or excessively concerned about health, or depressed. So actually, we have to deal with complex interactions and try to identify the main drivers related to the situation in which we have to deal with our patients. We have to identify modifiable factors and non-modifiable factors, and maybe even some risk factors. So there are reasons for a patient becoming a patient. And obviously, you can have some interesting therapy results, less pain, more load ability, more flexibility. But if the patient comes back to the same situation as before, actually these therapeutic results will have a very short life. So in the end, nothing changes. And again, how long do therapy results have to last to be considered successful? So with many patients, actually, the only way to guarantee ongoing change is to concentrate on behavioral change. Something has to change as compared to before. And that leads me to the second principle: promote a healthy lifestyle. But again, socioeconomic status is linked to stress and health. And that is one of the biggest determinants of health and mortality rates across all diseases in health psychology and behavioral medicine. Social isolation is linked to stress increase and decreases health. So friends are good for your health. And obviously in the last year, we have been very much confronted with social isolation due to COVID-19. That means a lot of these factors actually are non-modifiable. And again, psychosocial factors are strongly intertwined with health. So we can have a look at the physical problem, but very often the lived experience of the problem is far greater. And the context surrounding the problem can be actually even much bigger. So if I look at the perspective of the patient, I have to deal with meaning, suffering, experience, personal desire, beliefs, and how this problem affects you as a person. Whereas I look at the physiotherapists or the healthcare perspective, obviously we have to deal with science, pain physiology, pain models, and pain definitions. And that brings me to the following question: are we allowed to have enough insight in the patient's perspective or in the patient's past? And what if the patient's perspective is not supported by your understanding of science? Okay, that means that we have to offer change to the lived experience with varying conditions and context. And that brings me to the third principle. We have to accept a lot of variability. A bit like the variability of COVID-19. And again, variability of gender inequality. I'll come to around 7 variables, but maybe there are more. Ethnicity, 6 variables. Culture, genetics, phenotypes, and social variables. On the other hand, anatomical, biological, and maybe biomechanical variables, lifestyle variables. How does the individual person cope with stresses in his life? what are the individual biological hormonal interactions? And what is the patient's personality? So I come to a huge amount of potential combinations, and many of them actually are non-modifiable. So how complex is your puzzle if you have a patient in front of you? Have you seen a puzzle like this before? Or is the puzzle even so complex that it makes it impossible to find a solution? Okay, so even if you have an evidence-based treatment, it is not a guarantee that your evidence-based treatment will have the right and desired effects. The same goes for the non-evidence-based treatment. You can have interesting effects of a non-evidence-based treatment due to placebo effects. So these are all context-related effects. They're non-specific. Some of them will be specific, but some of them will be non-specific. Biological effects, psychological effects, and social effects. And that means we definitely need a link to research data to avoid observer bias and suggestion of causality. So if the argument is, yes, but my therapy works, or your argument is it doesn't work, doesn't really matter, because what you don't know, was it you? Did you do the wrong thing? Was your communication strategy wrong? Was it the technique? Was it the lack of interpersonal interaction? Or can we blame the patient? So, again, if you think in techniques, then most likely you are going to blame the technique and change the technique. If you are more aware about the problem within the interaction, you probably are working hard on the interaction. And again, most of the time, probably it's a bit of both. So again, placebo effects may make non-effective intervention actually effective. And an interesting article written by two persons, one Dutch and one Italian person, how to prove that your therapy is effective even when it's not. So everything in medicine is medicine and everything is poison. And it doesn't really matter. Explain pain or all exercises, all manual therapies, yoga, and every therapeutic interaction included. All treatments may have positive and adverse effects. All treatments can be provided in a competent way or ineffectively and incompetently. Rightly so that we should look at the pros and cons of all we do and the current state of how effectively therapeutic interventions are provided. So obviously that means please don't think only in techniques. Think especially in indications. Search for the evidence. Think in purpose if needed, and think in interactions. Let's deal with the subject pain for a moment. Again, nobody knows what is it like to be you and experience your pain. Nor anyone else besides yourself will ever know that. So to provide an ultimate, universal explanation for pain falls short of vanity and is simply unscientific. Something that has more to do with gurus than healthcare professionals. And these are quotes of Asaf Weizmann. You think that's exaggerated? Look at this quote. What happens in your head may change dramatically what happens in your body, and what happens in your body may dramatically change what happens in your brain. And that was done by neurobiologist and primatologist Robert Sapolsky from Stanford University. There are many debates around pain, and all these debates around pain are actually a testimony of awareness of the unknown. Where and how is pain generated? We do not really know. Pain is a sensation. Strong arguments by John Quinton and others. Pain is a perception and has an informative function. Strong arguments by Thacker and others. Pain is in the brain. Pain is not merely in the brain. Pain is learned behavior and therefore can be unlearned, is John Quinton asking. So how do we counter the pain experience if the experience is unique and personal? How can we assure that our patients get the most of the therapeutic encounter? So sensing and perceiving are connected, but different. Now, is pain merely a brain thing? Pain can be related to impaired tissue. We all know that. Pain can be related to impaired or oversensitive central nervous system. Or maybe related to impaired descending modulation. What is the role of consciousness? So sensation occurs when sensory receptors detect sensory stimuli, and that obviously is an ongoing process. And perception involves the organization, interpretation, and conscious experience of those sensations. So you might be looking for reality, but that is almost like looking for a needle in a haystack. And again, all these impairments can be very well interrelated and show clinical overlap. Interesting argument raised by Derek Griffin on Twitter, and most would agree that peripheral nociceptive input is an important consideration for central sensitization. There is suggestion that nociplastic pain may be a better clinical description. However, the latter, so nociplastic pain, requires evidence of non-peripheral nociceptive input. Can you see the problem? So the ASP definition requires peripheral nociception to be excluded. And there's no way of clinically doing this. And again, the two are not mutually exclusive, so fraught with problems. And then we have the primary and secondary pain concepts, all the assumptions that cannot be determined clinically in a valid way. And I think Derek has some very, very strong points here. So what leaves us? To rely on an intelligent guess, as already Gregory Grieve stated in the late 80s? Do we look for hints? Subjective and getting from hints from subjective and physical examination, from quantitative sensory testing? And again, what treatment? Is there a superior treatment? And obviously, every specialized group will say our treatment is specialized. But again, that can be very much related to observational group bias. I did A to my patient, that made a change, so A must be the right thing to do. What is the function of pain? Now, sensory inhibition acts as a filter. It is a selection for survival, and that goes for all the 5 senses. So in the presence of noise, your baby can sleep all the same. It acts as a filter. Whereas pain inhibition acts as a gate. There's no selection. There is a gate. Have a look at this patient. This is actually an ice hockey player. And he was so unfortunate that another player put his skate directly on his Achilles tendon and had a complete cut of his Achilles tendon. The interesting thing is, it happened during a match, and he fell down, but he actually thought that his skate was broken. So he was not aware of the complete cut of his Achilles tendon. So what he did, he was trying several times to get back on his skates again, but fell down all the time, not aware of any pain. Then in the end, he was able to crawl towards the exit, and the moment he was in the dressing room and they took his sock and his skate off, he realized that he had a wound. And in that moment, the pain came on. So actually, there was quite a long time of depressed awareness. And obviously, we know that happens also with sound. We've just spoke about it. You can have selective deafness. Sensations can be filtered out. It's a special hearing aid. It filters out criticism and amplifies compliments. Or pain can be very long-lasting. I've put my knee on a button of a mattress, and 8 months later it still hurts. So what are you saying? I've put my knee on a button of a mattress, and 8 months later it still hurts? Obviously, that's a clear case of increased awareness. If you hurt yourself putting a knee on a button, then most likely I would give you a couple of hours, and if I'm very generous, I say 24, maybe even 48 hours, but then your problem should be gone under normal circumstances. We cannot speak of an injury. The same goes for temperature. We have a sensitivity spectrum. I have patients who say that small changes from the air conditioning create pain attacks. Some of my patients say, I cannot walk outside with wet hair because then I get a headache. And on the other side of the spectrum, we have people who dive into frozen lakes. So the paradigm shift for pain management science has been the discovery of how little direct connection there is between what it looks like, what we ought to be feeling, and what we actually feel. Instead, persistent pain is often a kind of neural learning in which the central nervous system has become overly sensitized to a minor degree of irritation. And that's a quote from Dr. David Rice. So it's like there is something stuck on an alarm bell, and the alarm bell is set off by a feather, by a very small stimulus. And that is going to be interpreted in several ways by several healthcare providers. And obviously, that means we potentially have to deal with a huge problem. So on the one hand, we have pain without injury, and on the other hand, we have injury or possible injury without pain. And we know that the brain, or certain areas of the brain may play an excitatory role or an inhibitory role. But that's not necessarily reliable, apparently. And again, Kasser last year asked himself, why would a system purposefully prevent system-relevant information from transmission if it is the system's function to perform such transmissions? So that leaves us with a lot of question marks. In the year 2000, Age Muller talked about similarities between severe tinnitus and chronic pain. And he said there is considerable evidence that some forms of tinnitus and central neuropathic pain have in common functional changes of the central nervous system caused by expression of neural plasticity. So there is some kind of sensory vulnerability, and the sensory vulnerability not necessarily means that there is something wrong. On the other hand, we may have sensory robustness. And again, there's often no training required. Some babies simply don't sleep. And it's not always clear why. And other babies, as you see on the right picture, sleep in whatever circumstance they are. So, phantom sounds. Tinnitus is a phantom sound, and that brings on a higher risk for lower emotional well-being, a greater risk for depression and anxiety, and a sense of lack of control. So why is there no cure for tinnitus? Well, there are many different subtypes, and there is individual experience. There is no clear definition of a meaningful cure. The pathophysiology is unclear in most cases, and treatment research has a huge placebo effect. And again, can you see that this in some way sounds familiar if we look at pain research? So on the one hand, we have extreme vulnerability, and on the other hand, we have extreme robustness. But extreme vulnerability is no guarantee for developing pain, whereas extreme robustness is no guarantee for non-developing pain. And again, robustness, we can speak about physical robustness, but obviously your physical robustness is related to your genetical code. We can speak about cognitive or emotional or social or contextual robustness, and the same goes for fragility. Arjen Robben, a Dutch football player known to be a model of professionalism, a 20-year career, lots of goals and many assists. At the World Cup against Spain, they measured 37 kilometers per hour run, but he lost a huge amount of games because of injury. And nobody knows why, because actually he was training well. So is there something genetically wrong with Arjen Robben? And does that lead to his great vulnerability? By the way, if you look at the right list of players, he wasn't even the worst. So what makes some players very vulnerable for injury, for trauma, and what makes other players decisively less vulnerable? There's a huge amount of spectrum between psychophysical vulnerability and psychophysical robustness. I guess the maximum of psychophysical robustness is the ultra trail of the Mont Blanc run. That is a 170-kilometer run with at least 10,000 positive height meters. These persons run for more than 20 hours in the mountain. You can't even train for a trail run like that. So this is not obviously just a physical performance. This is also a psychological performance. This is lifestyle related. This is genetics related. This is vulnerability. And obviously that can be lifestyle related. That can be genetics related, mindset related, or context related. Pain is what the person says it is. And some persons, some patients may not fancy unsatisfactory structural explanations. On the other hand, there are some patients who said, finally, someone found the reason for my pain. And the reason is some kind of structural explanation. My scan shows arthritis, so that must be the cause of the pain, and there's nothing that can be done about it. So apparently, from the patient's perspective, being told is different than discovering yourself. And most likely, most of you will have heard either the testimony of Violetta Belton or of Keith Meldrum. They were speaking, their healthcare providers were speaking of movement dysfunction or control dysfunction or sensory dysfunction. They were told not to do squats, don't assume awkward positions, whatever that may mean. Don't sit more than 20 minutes. They were even told you can't be in pain because we fixed everything. Let's have a look at individuals' explanations, a study done by Paul Hodges and others. Recurrent low back pain. Most people with low back pain adhere to the traditional biomedical perspective of anatomical and biomechanical causes. A small number of people attributed non-physical, unknown, or complex causes to their persistent low back pain. And obviously that's tricky stuff. Other study, again, Paul Hodges is involved. This study again deals with individuals' perspectives. Study findings contrast with current pain theories, which suggest that there's a need for a reduced emphasis on biomedical causes for low back pain, especially when the pain is persistent. Whereas this paper tells us that recognition of patients' view on causes of low back pain flares is crucial to better guide clinical practice. Again, another study done by the group of Paul Hodges on patient perspective. The current literature points to the inefficacy of many of the factors participants reported as helping to reduce their effects of their condition, including the treatments that were commonly listed by the participants. And obviously, I guess that sounds familiar to all of us who deal with patients. So that brings on a lot of question marks. And obviously, we do not want to deny the personal individual experience of our patient. But maybe we can help discover alternative and more meaningful experiences. Literature says we need to be comfortable with a certain amount of uncertainty. But again, is your patient comfortable as well? This is an interesting paper done by a patient, Chiara Gusmini, in British Medical Journal in 2019. Should you first cure your ignorance, healthcare professionals? Her story is that she has lived 25 years with chronic pain. And it all happened when she was 12 years old. She was pushed to the ground outside school and fell on her back. Her persistent spinal pain was diagnosed as growth pains. And her pain became widespread when she approached her 20s. The next phrase, I've put it in a different color because I think this phrase is most likely the big game changer. So gradually she began to realize that if no one was able to help her, she had to help herself. And I eventually came in contact with a physiotherapist with extensive training in pain and exercise physiology. But my question would be, and I know the knowledgeable physio she went to. I actually have met Chiara Gusmini, and I know her physio, and I know her physio is extremely knowledgeable. No doubt whatsoever about that. But if Chiara would have met her knowledgeable physio at the age of 12 or 18 or even 24, would her story have been different? Did she just meet the right person? Or did she meet the right person at the right time? Or, let me say this a little bit different. Was Chiara ready for the applied treatment? So was her readiness the key to a success? She then continues, my kind of pain in particular could not be diagnosed by healthcare professionals because it was not visible with standard diagnostic tests. And just because you don't see it and you can't touch it, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist or is unworthy of note or care. And again, that raises the question, is Chiara one of the lucky ones because they didn't find anything to do? Because a lot of these patients actually get all kind of proposals for invasive treatments. When they find something, they want to fix it. And fixing it could be like doing Russian roulette. And maybe even Russian roulette not with one bullet out of 6 possibilities, but Russian roulette with 6 bullets out of 6. So the possibility that you hit her with one of these bullets and that the outcome is a disaster is far greater than compared to not doing any invasive therapy. Okay, so let's get back to exercise. So what is the solution? Do we have to exercise for all? A Cochrane Library review of 2017. The quality of the evidence examining physical activity and exercise for chronic pain is low. There are some favorable effects in reduction in pain severity and improved physical function, mostly of small to moderate effect and non-consistent across the reviews. On the other hand, there's high prevalence of daily and multi-site pain in this Danish study among 3,000 Danish adolescents. So almost 3,000 people had to fill in a questionnaire, and 33% reported multi-site pain, so pain in more than one region. Almost 20% reported daily pain, and 61% reported current pain in at least one region, with knee and back pain being the most common sites. And again, female sex, but also high level of sports participation were associated with increasing odds of almost daily pain and multi-site pain. So that leaves a thin evidence for more exercise. Another study by Michael Skovler-Ratliff, 5-year prognosis and impact of adolescent knee pain. 45% of adolescents with knee pain still experience frequent and intense knee pain 5 years later, severe enough to impact health behaviors and career choices. A Norwegian study, again looking at adolescents and later mental health disorders, multi-site adolescent musculoskeletal pain significantly associated with an increase in mental health care use and mental health disorders in young adulthood. Or this study by Charles Nelson, adversity in childhood is linked to mental and physical health throughout life. And obviously, it's easy to stigmatize people, and I don't want to stigmatize, but I have to be aware of these studies. So who has the problem may matter more than what the problem is. It's not only about your pathology. And that brings me to the 4th principle, patient-centeredness. Obviously, we would like the patient to participate, and we would like to share our decisions. We like to empower our patient and assure patient's self-efficacy. So are we looking at the statistical average here, or are we dealing with an individual case? And as Roger Carey states, it's always a unique process. There is no real algorithm, so N is 1. We have our patient-centered management, and I think it is wise to separate the patient-centered management in 3 phases. There is the initial phase where we want to gather as much information as we can about the person. We want to know the patient's concerns and motivation. The middle phase, the planning phase, where we look at objectives, shared decision-making, progression of treatment and compliance. And then there is the end phase, the self-management resilience phase, and exactly the reflection on what to do after the therapeutic period has ended. And again, goal setting is one of the strongest calls for action and energizes behavior. Goals should be challenging, specific, and congruent with the patient's self. Motivation is linked to mindset, beliefs, expectations, and self-concept. So again, what is my problem? Peter Sullivan proposed to separate traumatic musculoskeletal patients from non-traumatic musculoskeletal patients. And I think that makes sense. But are traumatic musculoskeletal patients really just always peripheral? And are chronic musculoskeletal patients, they have no periphery? So again, every separation calls for more questions. That brings me to the 5th principle: gather as much information as you can. And obviously we want to perform a structured and comprehensive subjective examination as well as a comprehensive and structured physical examination. That's part of our didactics. We want to know the patient's perspective. We want to listen. We have time. We share reflections and best options. We have a checklist of the physical examination. Know what is priority. Know the flaws and potential biases. And that brings me to the 6th principle. Rehabilitation is as active as possible. But as active as possible is not only physically active or biologically active. It's also psychologically, cognitive and emotionally active, and even, if possible, socially active. Sure, exercise is hugely important. It's the real polypill. And biological, physiological, and psychophysical or psychological adaptation, habituation, compensation, are absolutely very, very important themes to discuss. On the one hand, we have the physical part of bioplasticity, and on the other hand, we have a huge amount of favorable effects of active rehabilitation. So the rehabilitation process is an active process, by all means. The patient has to gain control and has to take responsibility for health. But how about compliance and adherence of our patients? Less than half of patients completed the recommended amount of exercise therapy in subacromial pain syndrome. So, and again, this most likely sounds in some way familiar for most physiotherapists. So more active is less pain. A study just recently done, 2019, a systematic review, increased sitting at work may protect against neck pain and low back pain, while increased physical activity during work and or leisure may increase the risk. There was no evidence supporting physical activity as a prognostic factor for low back pain. So exercise and pain, it's one of the possible strategies. In general, no big side effect, although the long-term effects are promising. But again, if we talk about long-term effects of physical activity, then we are very strongly connected to behavioral change. Again, we have to observe the individual. There is no one size fits all. We have to look for multidimensional, meaningful rehabilitation approach. And we do that in a movement continuum as proposed by Cheryl Cott. And there are many ways to influence our biology, biochemistry, and our psychological and physical load ability. So when loading, then how loading? How intense should your exercise be? Well, the first question is, what is the purpose of the exercise? Is it fitness, cardio, pulmonary, VO2 max, balance, control, coordination, or agility? Or is it endurance, strength, power, rate of force development, or efficacy? Is it related to pain, flexibility, metabolic disorders, immunological disorders, or psychological disorders? And actually, there's a vast spectrum of movement-related therapy. We accept very much that visualization and mindset and imagination of movement, as done by skiers before they have to do their course, it's actually helping active movement, helping performance at a high level, and is promoting efficacy. So again, if we accept that visualization, imagination of movement is important for active movement, then obviously if we go on with this spectrum, there is also maybe an indication for passive movement. There is an indication for active movement combined with passive movement, and there is an indication for active movements in every imaginable form. So actually, there is a vast spectrum. Now, I'm not saying that every patient has an indication for visualization, imagination of movement. I'm not saying that every patient has an indication for passive movement. What I'm saying is visualization may help active movements. Passive movement at some stages may help performance of active movements. So actually, we have to look for indications. Diane Allen proposed 6 dimensions within the movement continuum theory, but actually the basic human movements are 7, and there are a lot of variations of that. So pull, push, throw, catch, rotate, run, jump, crawl, climb, stretch. There are 11 basic motor skills, and there is the possibility of changing the stimulation, changing the vision, eyes open, eyes closed, hearing, introduce tactile information, internal focus, external focus, change the target, change the server, change the context, change the environment, work on motivation and concentration. And again, my question to all you out there, are we really prepared for this in our basic education? The 7th principle, we have to determine a starting point. And I use a checklist for that. So I want to know the age, the overall health, the comorbidity, the activity level, the type of disorder, etc., the psychological mindset, the safety issues of the patient. There's nothing worse than starting an exercise with too much load. But it's even worse to start an exercise or to continuously to underload your patients. So we can use rate of perceived exertion. That brings me to the 7th principle. Determine your starting point. Again, are you afraid of activity? Then you might need a helping hand. Some patients may say activity hasn't solved my problem. So what do you propose in that case? Patients want to know, what is my problem? I have a feeling that something is out of place. My physical examination, active as well as passive movements, are trying to reassure the patient, inform the patient. I'm in trouble because I've just finished my sports activity. A question often asked when I after a hockey game in the dressing room, and one of my players who just finished his activity wants to get therapy. And obviously, I cannot propose active therapy in that case. Or your older patient, 92 years of age, like happened last week with a bad shoulder. Today, I don't want to do gymnastics. The last time we did gymnastics wasn't good for me. Okay, obviously, again, this emotional answer or this emotional request needs obviously a satisfactory reply. So there's a purpose in clarifying, and there's a purpose in lending a helping hand. Again, where's your starting point? And how much of a helping hand do you need? And obviously, progression of treatment is mandatory. So if you start off with helping a person because there is a specific request, or there's a specific need, or there's a specific indication for that, then obviously we want to progress towards self-efficacy and being in control of the activity. So gradual progression means of exercise and gaining control, but also of cognition and understanding, and also motivation versus behavioral change. Planning and reaching obtainable goals of treatment is vital. So, and again, the young guy who started off needing a lot of help may develop into a progression and be a professional cyclist. That brings me to the 9th principle. We use a structured, broad-based reference frame approach to evaluate the patient's problems. And obviously, within our concept, we use the proposal done by Mark Jones, for example. Hypothesis categories by Mark Jones. Probably you're all familiar with hypothesis categories. Specific charts for specific problems. And again, this issue, without going deeper into this, because this is the subject which Gertie will follow up in her webinar. Again, can we see a recognizable pattern? But again, neuropathic pain can be actually judged wrongly. And maybe your labeled neuropathic pain patient might be rather a nosoplastic pain patient. So watch out for confounders. Again, the group of Peter O'Sullivan proposed this clinical translation framework, which I find extremely helpful. So I would advise you to look at this kind of information. Use questionnaires if needed. Use outcome measurements if needed. Evaluate the quality of the evidence, the effect size, the clinical significance, and the clinically meaningfulness. And again, what is clinically meaningful reduction in pain, and how can we define a clinical meaningful change in health rate, quality of life? And obviously, we can have questionnaires for that. The 10th principle, variety is normal. Use individual decision making. Use the concept of variety of stimulation, offer choice, offer challenge if needed, offer variety of context and surrounding, and offer a variety of sensory channels. And obviously, I can't highlight them all, but I think there are some very promising results of visual reality for chronic pain patients. There are the principles of motor learning as proposed by Ali Gokeler's group for knee pain. Or there is the same body perception questionnaire for persistent shoulder pain or for back pain. 11th principle, be aware of observation, interpretation, and reasoning fallacies. Be aware of cognitive bias. change the context and the perception will change. And again, this study most likely familiar because very much publicized, and there's a high amount of variability in reporting on lumbar spine MRI done by 10 MRI centers, so done by 10 different radiologists, and there's a high prevalence of interpretation errors. And again, don't delude yourself. I don't think, if we would be examined, I don't think that we are much better. And that brings me to the last principle. Observe, measure what matters, and monitor change. Use clinometrics, use clear and meaningful data, and compare data. And comparing data and giving feedback has a very strong psychological component other than physical and functional component. So use clinometrics and measure whatever you want to measure. So, rehabilitation principles. We have a patient-centered approach. Understand the clinical features in biological, psychological, and social context. Use hypothetical deductive reasoning. Never assume anything. Use models of reasoning and decision-making that are in the interest of the individual patient, supported by research evidence. Use planning and goal setting. Use the principle of progression of treatment. And use the principles of biological, psychophysical, and physiological adaptation, habituation, and compensation. Monitor change. Use feedback loops in monitoring. Monitor the favorable progress or any change in the rehabilitation progress. And last but not least, use critical thinking and evidence-informed handling. So if you look at this beautiful landscape, you should realize that this small river will be there, and the meadow will be there. Maybe you pick the sun at the same time as this picture was made, but the fog will be definitely unique for this picture. And that is what makes this picture unique. The same goes for the next picture. The sea will be there, the mountains will be there, but the arrangement of the clouds and the sun rays coming to the cloud makes this picture unique. So again, many of the factors with which we have to deal with our patients are unique for that patient. And again, we have ever-changing updates. Thank you very much for listening. If there are any questions, please fill out your question on your laptop, and I will see if I can deal with this. Thank you very much.
Sorry guys, please stay tuned. I think Rolf will join again soon and answer your questions. Rolf, if you just turn on your video, and guys, you can
yeah, there I am.
Start posting your questions, and Rolf will attend to your questions.
Where do I see the questions?
They come up in the chat to your right if you...
okay, I have to activate the chat. Okay, yes.
Yes.
Okay.
There's a lot of questions coming in right now, but yeah, if you want to pick a few.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, okay. Okay. How, Thanasis Leonas, how possible is to make strongly reliable and accurate studies on manual to complete exercise active modalities? Here in the UK, the National Health Service dismisses hands-on approaches in general due to poor evidence. Okay. Yeah, well, okay, so it's an interesting question. Most likely that brings us to qualitative research, I guess. So I think there's a desperate need for qualitative research in our work. Yeah, so and again, yes, there is a strong need for. I'm not really trying to promote in a specific way hands-on. Don't get me wrong here. The issue of tonight is to specifically promote the rehabilitation process, and again, manual therapy or manual handling can be part of that. That is my opinion. So let's scroll down. If I see another question. Okay. Jeremy Bertels. Hi, Jeremy. Hi, Rolf. I was wondering if there's a specific first question that you ask a patient during the intake. Yeah, I don't have a specific question which I ask during the intake. What can I do for you? Or what's the trouble? Tell me about your problem. Okay, or what brings you here? So actually, I don't start off with a question. I actually, obviously, we already have a little bit of a chat. But what kind of work do you do? And maybe I have some comments on the work the person does, or the hobbies the person does, or etc. etc. So again, I don't want to be fixed on a specific question. I know for didactic reason, Jeff Maitland proposed a first question, but yeah, I'm not always happy with that question. Okay, Maurice, how much of the reasoning are you doing actively, and how much are you doing by instinct? Ooh, okay. Yeah, I don't think that there's a lot of instinctive reasoning, I must say, which does not mean that a gut feeling isn't important. Obviously, a gut feeling is always important, but again, I strongly think that a gut feeling is in some sense a bit of a lack of awareness of all the reasoning processes you are going through. So, and that gives you the gut feeling. Okay. Yeah. So active reasoning processes. I'm actually very happy with the education I had, which was a reasoning-based education. And obviously, if you keep repeating reasoning, reflection, critical thinking, then obviously you are actually working on automation of your thinking processes. And as Mark Jones probably would say, it's thinking about your thinking processes which distinguishes clinical reasoning. I hope I answered your question, by the way, Maurice. Okay. How to deal with patients with central sensitization? Ooh, okay. Well, again, there's no recipe for that. Okay, so I think it is very important is my checklist. So, what is the general condition of this patient, and what made this person become a patient? And so again, that would be more important for me to. What is the mindset of this patient? How is the physical condition? Are there any major comorbidities? What has already been done with you? What is your history? What is your therapeutic history? That even if there is a hypothesis in that direction, there is a central sensitization, or you have reasons to believe in your subjective and physical examination that there are strong hold-ons for central sensitization, then again the presentation and the way you deal with that can be very individual. And again, I hope the message came through as active as possible. As active as possible does not mean only physically active, means cognitively, emotionally, and also behaviorally active. Okay, I see a lot of friends, so thank you all for the nice words. Okay, thank you very much. Scrolling down, I think I had them all now. I don't think that there are any more questions. I don't think so.
Okay. There are some more coming in at the top, Rolf.
Okay, I go to the top.
There are some new popping in.
Okay, good. Oh yeah. There they are. Okay, Andreas Dandler. Hello, Rolf. Do you think the diagnostic labeling has to change in the future? Thank you for the presentation. I think the way diagnosis. I mean, we don't, physios don't make a diagnosis. We can speak of a physiotherapeutical diagnosis, but I think I'm not sure to which diagnosis you are referring to now. But let's say the classic medical diagnosis is unfortunately all too often related to a tunnel vision. And so I think diagnostic labeling has to change and will change in the future. That still may take a while, but I am actually almost sure that this will change. This has to change. We cannot go on like this. Okay. Massimo, Sanna. Do you have a strategy to keep your eyes open to literature and updates? Any source would be recommended. Oh my God, there's so incredibly amount of sources. But so I recommend you to become a follower, and maybe you want to become a Twitter follower of interesting persons and personalities. Maybe you want to become a follower on Facebook. So I actually follow many persons which I think are extremely interesting and extremely helpful in reasoning processes and in their proposals they make, in the studies they propose. So yeah, I would recommend that. I would recommend to scrutinize the literature, and obviously, as you have seen, that is a huge amount of work. So that means you need to get organized. So the way I get organized is that we take subjects. So we have, let's say we have 10 friends. And within these 10 friends, we divide the subjects. So the responsibility for neck shoulder area, the responsibility for lumbar area, the responsibility for hip, or etc., etc. So you divide. Maybe someone is looking for pain, the other one is looking for active rehabilitation, etc., etc. And then that person has the task to scrutinize that part of the literature and then share the information, or let's say the interesting information you get from that part. So yeah, I would strongly recommend you to get organized, because it's virtually impossible to continuously deal with the continuous stream of updates in our work. Okay, will there be, Corinna, will there be some kind of handout for these webinars? I am not informed about that, so that's a question you have to ask the IMTA people in charge. So I don't really know that. Alessandro Bartolini, how do you think is a smart way of creating a dialogue with other healthcare professionals to send a patient for a referral? Okay, I've done that recently, a very complicated case. It is a case I also have publicized in the Facebook pages, More Science, so Apply Science to Physical and Manual Therapy. So that specific case has been sent to for a second opinion to an orthopedic surgeon who I know well, and obviously who was also pre-informed. So we had a telephone discussion on this patient, and that was actually a big success. So what I try to do is to send patients to referrals I know I can trust, and yeah, so that's the way I get organized. And if I don't know a specialist, then I ask if some of my colleagues, of some of my medical doctors I work with, or some of the friends who work in the healthcare sector have a specific name to give me. Okay, so that's the way I would organize. Okay, Harun, and I'm sorry, Harun, I can't really say your last name, but it looks Turkish, I guess. Do you think that tending to biopsychosocial model is due to existing gap in human biology related to pain in this area? Oh, let me read that again. Do I think that tending to a biopsychosocial model is due to an existing gap in human biology? Okay, yeah, well, if you mean that the human biology is only looked upon as something which has got to do with the physical part of our body, then yeah, then obviously that is the gap. So actually the biopsychosocial model is a model which was born thanks to the awareness that the strict biological biomechanical model, biological in the sense biomechanical model, was not, and the structural model was not satisfactory. So if you want to know more about that, then I strongly recommend you to look at Ellie Hegeveld's lecture webinar in a couple of days. I don't know exactly when she's on, but because she's dealing exactly with the biopsychosocial model. So, and she's extremely knowledgeable in that area. So I would refer you to strongly to her. Okay, Davide Quadrio, which is the colleague of my work. Hi, Davide. In which context or with what kind of patient can we use placebo effect on purpose? Oh, well, yeah. It's a typical Davide Quadro question. Okay, obviously we don't have a placebo metro, so we can't measure the placebo effect. It's very likely that this effect always plays either placebo or nocebo effects always play a role in the background of what we're dealing with, what we're doing. Yeah, I sometimes use this effect when a patient has a very strong belief, very much convinced in one direction. I obviously have to be very careful with the words I use, and I would be, let's say, more aware of the nocebo effects of my handling and of my interaction if I would use words which would contrast the thinking of my patient. So, yeah, in that case, a strategy could momentarily be that I tend to agree with the patient, yes, or I leave it a little bit in the middle, but okay. So yeah, I'm not sure if I answered your question, but you can ask me again tomorrow, David, if we see each other tomorrow. So, okay, any other questions? Fatun Saliu, what is a placebo therapy or effect that we can give or prescribe? Or yeah. I think we don't want to prescribe placebo effects as a therapy. I don't think we want to do that. I think we want to give evidence-based therapies, and that doesn't mean that evidence-based therapies don't have a placebo effect, but at least they don't have only placebo effects. Okay, so again, Faton, yeah, I don't want to prescribe a placebo therapy. Okay.
So thank you very much. The voice from the off. I think we're nearing the end.
Yeah, I just want to ask, answer just one question of Davide.
Sure.
I know Davide Forzini. So, hi Rolf, how do you keep the patient focused on your knowledge and advice when the medical environment provides the patient with information in the opposite direction? Oh, Davide, that is one of the biggest frustrations sometimes. I completely agree. Yeah, what I try to do, so how do I keep my patient focused on the knowledge and the advice, which is evidence-based? Then obviously I tend, if the patient is interested in that, I tend to help the patient in reading information. So I actually we go through the evidence. And that is a strategy. So yeah. So that I would advise you that. Okay. Are we done? Mario, are you still?
I think so, yes.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Rolf, for an awesome presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for joining. It was a tremendous success. We had 466 people watching.
Okay, thank you.
A lot of questions, I think. I would like to point out our next webinar, which is coming up in a week's time, so next Thursday. And if you haven't signed up yet, please go to our website and sign up. There is more exciting stuff to come. So thank you from my part for this evening, Rolf. And probably you want to say final words to the audience, and then we're gonna
okay.
this session.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Bye bye.